Hi guys. Today we're going to read a story called Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown. Breakfast was ready. "I will go wake up the boys," Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband George Lambchop. Just then their younger son Arthur called from the bedroom. "Hey, come and look, hey!" Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop went into the bedroom. "Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people," Mr. Lambchop said. "Try to remember that." "Excuse me," Arthur said, "but look!" He pointed to his brother Stanley's bed. Stanley's big bulletin board had fallen on top of him while he was asleep, but Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he had gone right on sleeping until he heard Arthur shouting. "What's going on here?" Stanley called out cheerfully from under the bulletin board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop lifted up the board. "Heavens!" said Mrs. Lambchop. "Gosh!" said Arthur. "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," said Mr. Lambchop. "Darndest thing I've ever seen." "Let's all have breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Then I will take Stanley to see Dr. Dan." "How do you feel, Stanley?" Dr. Dan asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I felt sort of tickly for a while," Stanley Lambchop said, "but I feel fine now." "Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases," says Dr. Dan. Mrs. Lambchop said that Stanley would need new clothes now, but it would be hard to find the right size. Dr. Dan's nurse measured Stanley. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed. He would just lie down and slide through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be a help, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her best ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and another pair out of his pocket. He tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She let him down between the bars and moved him up and down from side to side. Two policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said. "My son is at the other end of this shoelace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We've caught a cuckoo." Just then Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up. He was holding the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame!" "We're sorry, lady," the policeman said. "People should think twice before saying rude things," said Mrs. Lambchop. "And then they should not say them at all." One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved to California. Thomas wanted Stanley to visit him. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California costs a lot of money," he said. "I will have to think of some cheaper way." That evening, Mr. Lambchop brought home a very large brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a flat cigarette case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope, but it was still much cheaper than a train or airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. Lambchop put Stanley into his envelope. Mrs. Lambchop put in the egg salad sandwich and the case full of milk. They mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but once he was inside the box, Stanley straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was worried because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She tapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Stanley called back. "Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get too warm, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys sent him home in a beautiful white airmail envelope they had made themselves. They wrote this end up on both sides. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out walking with him on Sunday afternoons, but it was hard when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop found that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string. Then he could carry Stanley like a package and hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, they met an old friend of Mr. Lambchop's, a man he had not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to fix up the house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son, Stanley." Stanley and Arthur were in the park. Many boys were flying beautiful big kites with long tails. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed some string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He tied the string to himself and gave Arthur the other end to hold. He ran across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the wind. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to fly. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to go up, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to go fast. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, a little at a time, and then he would zoom down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley flew high above the trees. He was a beautiful sight in his green sweater and brown trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley flew right and then left in the long matched swoops. He zoomed at the ground like a rocket and turned up again towards the sun. He made circles and eights and crosses and a star. Nobody ever flew the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. After a while, Arthur got tired of running about with the end of the string. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and asked him to go with them for a hot dog. Arthur left the string tied to a tree. He did not notice that the wind was blowing the string and getting it all tangled up in the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not know how low he was until the leaves touched his feet, and then it was too late. He was caught in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. That evening at bedtime, Arthur said he was sorry, but Stanley was still cross. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the Lambchops. Mr. Dart was the head of the famous Museum of Art. At breakfast one morning, Stanley heard his mother and father talking about Mr. Dart. Mr. Lambchop was reading in his newspaper. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, "that another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. The newspaper says that Mr. O.J. Dart is at his wit's end. The police are no help. Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. 'We think it is a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery. which makes them very hard to catch. However, my men and I will keep trying. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves are very tricky," Mr. Dart said. "They work at night, and the museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless." Suddenly, Stanley had an idea, and he told it to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother says it is all right, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lambchop said it was all right, "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I won't have you up till all hours unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall where the best and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a big painting that showed a man with a beard and a floppy velvet hat. The man was playing a violin for a lady who was lying on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them. 3 fat children with wings were flying around at the top of the painting. "That," Mr. Dart said, "is the most expensive painting in the world." There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall, and we shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on a disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley said, "and I brought one. My cowboy suit. Nobody will know me in it." "No," Mr. Dart said, "I have picked out something for you to wear." He gave Stanley a long white dress, a pair of little pointed shoes, a wide straw hat, and a wig and a stick. The stick was curved at the top and had a ribbon on it. "In this shepherdess disguise," Mr. Dart said, "you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have cowboy pictures in the main hall." Stanley was disgusted. "I will look like a girl, that's what I will look like," he said. "I wish I had never had my idea." But he was a good sport, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb into the empty picture frame. Mr. Dart had put 4 small spikes in the wall, one for each hand and foot to rest on. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture. "Except for one thing," Mr. Dart said. "Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and at the sky, and you do not look happy, Stanley." Stanley tried hard to get a faraway look in his eyes. He even tried to smile a little bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a minute. "Well," he said, "it may not be art, but I like it." He went off to take care of the rest of Stanley's plan. Now Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could see the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting, as he was, for something to happen. Time passed, and Stanley got very, very tired. Maybe they won't come, he thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and the main hall got pitch dark. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle under his wig. Creak! The sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall. Stanley saw a tiny yellow light of light. The sound came again, and the light got bigger. A trapdoor had opened in the floor, and now 2 men came up through it. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trapdoor into the museum. That was why they had never been caught, and now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. Stanley held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. "This is it, Max," said the first one. "This is where we pull a sensational job while everybody else is asleep." "Right, Luther," said the other man. In all this great city, there is no one to stop us. Ha, thought Stanley Lambchop. That's what you think. The sneak thieves put down their lantern. They took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max? The first man asked. Well, we'd kill him. What else? His friend said. That was enough to frighten Stanley. He was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. This sheep girl, Luther said. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared. Just in time, Stanley got a faraway look in his eyes again and smiled, sort of. You're crazy, Luther, Max said. She's smiling. And what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley very angry. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned back to the world's most expensive painting. Then he shouted in his loudest voice, Police! Police! Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here! The sneak thieves looked at each other. Max, said the first one, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. I think I did too, said Max in a quivery voice. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest. You'll get a rest, all right, shouted Mr. Dart. He came rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guards and policemen behind him. You'll get arrested, that's what. Ha ha ha. The policemen took the sneak thieves off to jail. The next morning in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all the newspapers. Now Stanley was famous everywhere he went. People stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, over there, Harriet, over there. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves, and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering and the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came another change, and it was not a nice one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. Hello, super skinny, they would shout. Stanley told his parents how he felt. It's the other kids I mind, he said. They don't like me anymore because I'm different. Flat. Shame on them, Mrs. Lambchop said. It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion, for that matter, the color of their skin. I know, Stanley said. Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody. Perhaps, said Mrs. Lambchop, but they can try. Later that night, Arthur heard the sound of crying. In the dark, he crossed the room to Stanley's bed. Are you okay? He said. Go away, Stanley said. Don't be mad at me, Arthur said. You're still mad because I let you get caught in the tree the day you were my kite. Skip it, will you, Stanley said. I'm not mad. Go away. Please, let's be friends. And Arthur began to cry too. Oh, Stanley, he said, please tell me what's wrong. Stanley was quiet for a long time. The thing is, he said, I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like other people. But I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick. Oh, Stanley, Arthur said. He dried his tears on a corner of Stanley's sheet. He could think of nothing more to say. Don't talk about what I just said, Stanley told him. I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse. You're brave, Arthur said. You really are. He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the dark, being friends. They were still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. Suddenly, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big toy box. He began to dig through the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur pushed aside a football and some lead soldiers and airplanes and lots of wooden blocks, and then he said, Aha! He had found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and closed his lips about it so that no air could get out. "I'll go slowly," Arthur said. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand at me." He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks puffed out a bit. Arthur kept on pumping. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around the inside of him. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons of his pajama top popped off. Pop, pop, pop. A minute more, and he was all rounded out. Head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. "It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons," he said. "Maybe a shake would help." Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop came into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. "We heard you," said Mr. Lambchop, "up and talking when you should be asleep, huh? Shame on—" "George!" said Mrs. Lambchop. "Stanley's round again." "You're right," said Mr. Lambchop. "Good for you, Stanley." "I did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Everyone was very excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and then they turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon, all the Lambchops were asleep. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again next time.